Hello and welcome to Unstress. My name is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I am recording this podcast, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And as I've said many times, I do this because I believe we have, firstly, pay our respects to the oldest surviving culture on the earth. 65,000 years is pretty impressive, so I think we have a lot to learn. And there are many things to learn specifically, I think, about connection and respect with the land and with people. In fact, just with the whole world. So that's my acknowledgement. Now, today we're going to explore women's health, and this is an important subject for not just women, but for those of us that have the pleasure of sharing our lives with women as well. I think we all need to educate ourselves about each other's health. My guest today is Brenda Rogers. Now, Brenda is a naturopath, a nutritionist. She's a certified coach. She's a yoga teacher. She's a workplace trainer, and our focus is very much on workplace wellness. In 2023, she's a natural fertility practitioner, a wise woman educator. We go into a lot of that in this podcast. And also, as though that's not enough, she also has an MBA from Macquarie University. So we are going to be talking about women's health. And Brenda and I got to know each other through the Weston A. Price Foundation. And to regular listeners of my podcast who have read my book, you will know, but I will remind you now, that Weston A. Price was a dentist in the first half of the 20th century. In fact, in the 1920s and 30s, he embarked on a discovery tour, on research. In fact, he was actually one of the most respected researchers in the American dental community. But the research he undertook was to find out what caused tooth decay, which was rampant. It was absolutely at epidemic proportions in the first part of the 20th century. Interestingly, dental decay is still, along with periodontal disease, the two most common non-communicable diseases known to man, woman, or child, and dwarf cardiovascular disease, cancers, autoimmune conditions. Oral diseases are a major problem. But they were an even greater problem in the early part of the 20th century. And he wanted to find out what was the cause of tooth decay. So he went around the world and visited various traditional cultures to discover whether they suffered from tooth decay. And what he found was quite remarkable. And I truly believe is probably as even more important today, this research, than it was then. What he found was that people on a traditional ancestral diet focused on nutrient-dense foods not only did not suffer from tooth decay, but they also had enough room for all 32 of their teeth, meaning they had really broad jaws and airways, because, again, any regular listener will know that the size and shape of your mouth determines the size and shape of your upper airway. So when I include dental stress in my stress model, it's not just because dental decay and periodontal disease are the two most common non-communicable diseases on earth. That's a WHO report in 2022 confirming that. But also 90% of the population, in fact 95% or more of the population in our modern world, and I suspect you listening to this would be part of this, do not have all 32 of your teeth through and in perfect alignment. And if that's the case, you by definition have a narrower jaw and more crowded teeth than you should ideally have. So what Weston A. Price found was that people on that diet, traditional ancestral diet of nutrient-dense foods, had not only no tooth decay, not only enough room for all of their teeth, but did not suffer from any of the comorbidities or chronic degenerative diseases that we see so commonly in our Western society. As I mentioned, they include cardiovascular disease, cancer, autoimmune conditions. And he wrote a book called Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. What he found was much more than what he set out to do. And that was, he found the cause of tooth decay, but he also found the cause of physical degeneration. And what was so interesting about this was that he would go nearby to the towns and cities that people had left their traditional villages and moved into, and those people, that same genetic group, suddenly suffered from all of those diseases, and in one generation went from having broad, open jaws, lots of room for their airway and no physical degeneration, to suffering from narrow jaws and crowded teeth and all of those diseases. So the Weston A. Price Foundation celebrates that important piece of research and reinforces what a nutrient-dense diet is all about. And what was also interesting was that he travelled to Indigenous cultures in Australia, in New Zealand, in Polynesia, in Malaysia, in the highlands in the Andes, in Native American communities, in Inuit cultures in the Arctic, in hill tribes on the Serengeti, on tribes, the Maasai tribesmen in Africa, in traditional villages in the Outer Hebrides. So there was an incredible range of foods that were being consumed, which is really interesting in and of itself. But what he also found when he took samples of those back and analysed them, he found that there was 10 times the amount of water-soluble vitamins and minerals, 4 times the amount of fat-soluble vitamins like A, D, E, and K, and you need those fat-soluble vitamins to absorb the water-soluble minerals and vitamins, and that the best source of those fat-soluble vitamins was from animal sources raised on healthy pastures. So it ticked so many of the boxes and is one of the reasons why I, and obviously Brenda, feel that the Weston A. Price Foundation has such an important message to play. I hope you enjoy this conversation I had with Brenda Rogers. Welcome to the show, Brenda.
Thank you, Ron. Thanks for having me.
Brenda, you and I we've met many years ago through the Weston A. Price Foundation, and some of my listeners may not be aware of what it is about, but I think our discussion today will shed some light on it. Maybe you could share with us why you were interested in the Weston A. Price Foundation, what it meant to you as a clinician.
Yeah, well, I had studied nutrition as part of my naturopathic qualification twice. I went and did my naturopathic qualification a second time around because I left it for a while and then had to go back and requalify, and separated out the nutrition qualification from the naturopathic qualification to have more advanced nutrition, and still didn't learn Weston Price and the Wise Traditions diet. And I thought I knew what nutrition was about. And then I think in the conversations I'd heard about Dr. Price and his book, and I even had a copy once, which I never read. It was a bit textbooky. And then I started working out at Billabong Retreat as their nutrition. I'd come in and do the nutrition talk twice or 3 times a week. And the lady who owned it was really a big fan of Weston Price and really lived it every day in her life. And she inspired me. And so I got back in touch with it. And they were about to bring one of the ladies Hilda, who does the Weston Price podcast.
Yes,
in the US.
We've had her on as a guest, Hilda Gore.
Yeah. And she was coming out to Australia for a tour.
Mm-hmm.
And I went, I've got to be a part of this. I've just got to learn more. All I want to do is learn more. And in the process, I got invited to be the local chapter leader, the volunteer chapter leader, and thought, well, I don't really know what I'm talking about, but maybe this will be how I'll learn how to understand, because it was kind of deep. It was nutrition at a deeper level in so many ways. And it was also, as they say in the textbook, a little bit politically incorrect, in that it was counter to a lot of that nutrition narrative that is out there in the marketing world and in the business world, and to a large extent in the medical world as well. So part of me loved that. It was a little bit rebellious in a way. But it opened up this beautiful perspective on nutrition that I was really looking for. And it was about connecting with the source of the food, the provenance of the food, where it came from mattered as much as its nutrient content, whether it was lovingly made, whether it was locally made, how well the farmer was looked after, and so it's really enabled me as a woman with a history of eating issues and body issues. It really opened up a much healthier perspective around food than I'd ever had before.
Mm-hmm. It's so interesting to hear you say, to a large extent, what you've just said and identified is ignored in the medical profession. I know my own daughter went and studied nutrition, and it was definitely not even talked about in nutrition. And it is so far removed from the Australian healthy eating guidelines, which most well-meaning doctors and health practitioners would look to for advice. So the absence of that just foundational advice and approach to nutrition is so absent from the mainstream that I like you, have been familiar with Western A Price for many, many, many years. And I still think of it as being possibly the most important research that was ever done for so many reasons. But you then went on in your clinic to explore mainly women's health issues. I wondered if you might just give us a little bit of an overview of what some of the issues that commonly women, come into you for advice for. I know you've got a particular focus, and we're going to get onto that, but just generally speaking.
Well, I think most naturopaths specialise in women's health because women are more interested in their health than men, which is perhaps a gross generalisation, but there is a lot of truth in that. So we tend to be more interested in women's health, also because women's health is more complicated. We've got our hormonal system, which, as men know, complicates us ladies. And but being primarily a naturopathic nutritionist, even though I use herbs and I'll use homeopathics and other modalities, aromatherapy and yoga and that kind of thing, I find that a lot of the conditions that women are dealing with come from a disconnection from food and the outsourcing of food to the big food companies, which we've kind of all done in the last few decades, and stress. And both those things greatly impact gut health. So I went on to study the GAPS protocol, which is gut and psychology syndrome protocol, and that is aligned with Western Price. And I do a lot with gut health because gut health is the source of everything, and stress can impact that quite severely. And my preference is to work with women over 40, although I wouldn't say no to a 25-year-old or a gentleman as well. In fact, I had a man here this morning, a 54-year-old Mexican man, so it's fascinating. But I think what I love about where I've come to over the years is, and what we specialize in as natural therapists, which is a little bit different to the medical profession, is that we're always looking for that root cause. Mm-hmm. We're looking for that thing that is going to make the biggest difference with the smallest amount of changes and interruption to a person's life. And you have to start with the gut, because if someone's constipated or has some diarrhea or loose stools or burping or reflux or indigestion, then you have to get that right first before you address the hormones or the headaches or the skin condition, because without that being right, nothing else will really resolve itself properly. And so there's a bit of there's the phases of treatment that have to occur with someone. So in a sense, I don't specialize in women's hormones necessarily, because hormones can be also related to gut health. But the age group that I work with is largely, many of them are having hormonal issues, but then so are the 30-year-olds and the 20-year-olds with their cycle. So women's health just includes a lot of hormonal stuff. So
yeah, it's interesting to hear you talk about the gaps, which is, as you said, the gut and psychology syndrome, because I once asked our resident gastroenterologist, Dr. Pran Yoganathan, what he thought of the gut as the second brain, and he disagreed. He actually said it was the first brain. And when you look at it, yes, I know. When he said he disagreed, I thought, oh, this is going to be interesting. But actually, to go on and raise raise the ante a little bit and say, no, the gut is actually the first brain. And when you look at it evolutionarily speaking, or a lot of very simple organisms have guts before they have brains, and so it's just so critical to everything. So not just mood and food, but mood and immunity, and mood and function, food and function, etc. So, but getting to the root cause of things is I think one of the most exciting things and challenging things about going in nutritionally and naturopathy approach to this. I know a lot of women, I mean, infertility is a pretty big issue in our day and age. And I know things like PCOS and endometriosis, polycystic ovarian syndrome and endometriosis. And I know the lead times on these are really long. How when you are starting with the woman, comes to you for a particular issue, where do you start? I mean, he's talking about starting with the gut. How do you approach that?
I start by getting to know the person. The first session is the case history, and that's really just about understanding the various layers of the person, spiritually, emotionally, and even intellectually, as well as physically. So, you could have 5 people with a gut problem, and the treatment for each one is different, because one is really, everything's tense. They're a worrier or an anxious person. And so their gut issues healing relates to helping them relax. Whereas someone else, it might be just eating a high sugar diet or a high grain diet, and they need to a little less sweetness in their life, and they need to shift around the diet and support around that. So the getting to know the person is absolutely the first step, and being a really good listener, being able to hear beneath the words, reading body mannerisms and body types and the size and the shape and the color and all the rest of it of the body is really an important process for getting to that root cause.
It makes, this is part of the, I think, challenge for so many people, that I think the average length of a medical consultation is somewhere between 7 and 15 minutes. And, you highlight the importance of getting to know a person as being part of that personalised approach. Very difficult in that short period to achieve that kind of thing, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure what to say about that. That's the current medical system, and it's free, and it's a machine that serves a purpose. And to be a naturopath outside of that is sometimes quite challenging, because people have to pay for that time. And but I don't need a lot of clients. I like to give a lot of attention, and the results are extremely rewarding, because the transformation that occurs, and teaching a person along the way about themselves. People are always fascinated by themselves. That's why they want to know their astrology sign, or their body type or something. But I don't think we can separate our personalities and our life situations from our health. to me, they're one and the same. And to me, the body is talking to us. So, we have a connection to the world and to others, and a relationship with ourselves, and a relationship to, the higher thing, whatever we want to call that. And sometimes we don't listen very well to that communication. And so, in its wisdom, infinite wisdom, the universe, or whatever you want to call that, will speak to us through our bodies. And, my observation in terms of talking about what I see a lot in the women that I work with, and men, is that we live a lot above the neck. We are in our heads. We are academic. We are intellectual. We are analyzers. We think too much. We do too much. And a lot of the healing, to be able to listen to that first brain, the gut, you actually have to have some presence, some awareness of the rest of your body. And so I find there's a lot of re-education for women and men, especially around 50. I find that's a great time to sort of awaken to that. And it's like, yeah, I think I need to do some yoga or some meditation, or spend a bit more time at the beach surfing, or whatever it might be, so that I can slow down my mind and be more present in my body, so I can listen to that inner wisdom and listen to my intuition and be a more intuitive eater, and do those things that I already know that I should be doing, but I'm not doing them. Because, we're mostly we're dealing with really intelligent, competent people. And it's like, they know they should be drinking more water, right? You don't have to tell them. You might need to remind them, but then it's like getting curious about, okay, so how come you're not doing what you know you should be doing? And that's a different conversation, right? That's getting into taking responsibility for your choices, and often listening to the excuses with kindness and compassion, and going, okay, well, maybe we should be working a little bit on this, rather than just telling you what you should and shouldn't be eating. There's a softer, gentle approach to this that will help you to do to be more of the healthy person, rather than to do more of the healthy person. And that's when you get permanent, long-term change. And I think that could be a year for somebody to really invest in themselves, but that is extraordinary transformation.
Yes, and actually people's frame of reference is their own experience. So, which, not surprisingly, I know that sounds obvious, but they think that what they are experiencing is normal. This is just the way it's been. It's just the way it's always been. It might be, you mentioned already, indigestion or burping, or gas or wind or constipation or diarrhea, and this is just the way it is. The body does send us some important messages on a daily basis. And I think it would be worth reminding our listener of some basics about what is, I often ask, what does your poo say about you? I actually do mention that. It's, what should we be, what is ideal? What, in your view, what to remind our listener, what is ideal? I mean, what should we be seeing? What should we be observing from ourselves on a daily basis?
Yeah, well, I guess, if you go to see a doctor, they have health markers. It might be your cholesterol and your blood pressure and your blood sugars, and that's important. But as complementary medicine practitioners or natural medicine practitioners, we have other health markers, and definitely the bowel is one of them. So bowel symptoms, upper bowel or upper digestive system would be being able to eat pretty much anything without consequence, and without burping, indigestion, reflux, nausea. Similarly, at the other end, being able to go to the bathroom every day without any straining, and the quality of the stool. The quality of the stool tells you a lot about the functioning of the digestive system. So yes, the digestive function is a huge health marker for us. I would say also for a woman, her reproductive cycle is a health marker. And, sometimes women don't even know what's normal. And so it might be educating a person on both those things, what's normal.
What's
So that
ideal? What's ideal in that area of
it's a lunar.
I mean, I know it varies quite a bit from woman to woman, but what's an ideal when someone comes in to you? What would you say is an ideal, reproductive cycle?
No pain.
Mm-hmm.
The pain is not something women were born because they're descendants of Eve to have.
Yes, no,
That's
not an uncommon
that's
belief.
rubbish.
Yep.
I know, right? 28-day cycle, so it's in line with the lunar cycle. It may not line up with the dark moon, and typically women close to the land menstruated at the dark moon and ovulated at the full moon. That we're a bit removed from that these days, but you can still have a healthy cycle. The flow being the actual period being around 7 days. If you're not yet into your 40s, it kind of shortens as you get into your 40s. A healthy flow, a healthy color, no clots, no pain, and no PMS. PMS is also not normal. We normalize a lot of pathology in our culture. It's like, oh, well, it's just because I'm a woman, or it's just because of something. And we have to confront some of those narratives.
So, of the people that do come to see you, I mean, talking about what is ideal, you talk about pain-free, good flow, no clotting, no PMS, regular. These are what we would ideally strive for, and as you say, often pathologized or normalized. Actually, that kind of thing is, oh, you're having your periods. Oh, come on. It's actually, we've done a program on endometriosis, which I was shocked to learn of how prevalent it is. But I was even more shocked to realize that the average time it takes to actually diagnose this is somewhere between 7 and 14 years. So I can only imagine the suffering and pain that many, many women have gone through. And many partners. Now, this is the other reason why I think this is such an important thing for men to be aware of too, because, our partner, we need to know what each other potentially can be going through. And that is a good example of a condition that's been normalized and dismissed, isn't it? Is that not it's not an uncommon thing you find for women that come in to see you?
Extremely common, poorly diagnosed, and I think there's a lot of invalidation of women's period pain for various reasons, and so it's not being picked up. And also, in my understanding, and I believe there's a reasonable amount of research backing this up, that endometriosis is not exactly it occurs in the reproductive area, but the issue is it's autoimmune, or it relates to inflammation and autoimmunity, which we know from our nutrition understanding comes back to gut. So the primarily toxicity comes from the gut. The most amount of toxicity comes from the gut, and the most amount of inflammation comes from the gut. And the other aspect of the hormonal system being a health marker is that the body has to be in pretty good shape to have a regular, normal menstrual cycle, because the hormones, that process of the hormonal cycling each month is very sensitive. You have to be healthy, really healthy, for that to occur well, because it's delicate. It takes a lot of effort and energy of the body to do. Every day is different. It's a energy intensive process, and so the treatment even for endometriosis and other hormonal conditions like infertility and like as you said, PCOS, these are in the realm of lifestyle medicine. And yes, you can take an anti-inflammatory or a steroid or something like that, but it really doesn't get to the root. You can remove endometriosis adhesions and that kind of thing, but it doesn't resolve the problem. And so it's great for us to have in our toolkit the tools to resolve these things, but they're often very difficult for a person to implement. So, there's a whole batch of problems around even identifying through the symptoms that you've got endometriosis or some of these other conditions. But then, and it's the same with menopause. I think I should do a podcast or a webinar at least for the husbands and the partners of menopausal women, so that they can understand what is normal and what's abnormal and what their wife or partner is going through, because it's big.
Well, we're going to talk about menopause, and I think we can both agree it isn't a pathological condition. But coming back to endometriosis, or actually autoimmune, I think there are now up to 100 autoimmune conditions, and I know there's a bit of argument about whether endometriosis and PCOS is strictly speaking that or not. But to your point about the gut, I know naturopathy and nutrition, well, naturopathy certainly has been talking about leaky gut for the last 30 or 40 years, and medicine has more recently accepted it under the moniker of intestinal permeability. Sounds so much more authentic, doesn't it? But the process is the same. I wondered if you could just give us leaky gut 101, because these autoimmune conditions are, I think, how they manifest themselves may well have a genetic component, but the root cause is there's a common root cause. And I just remind our listener a little bit about what about leaky gut.
Well, that's absolutely huge, that question, Ron. And
give us 101.
101. 101 is that effectively the breakdown of food in the digestive system isn't occurring properly, and it's upsetting the small intestine and the large intestine, and things are going through that shouldn't, setting up an immune response. Because the job of the gut is to pretty much look after our immunity. It doesn't like things it doesn't recognize, and it immediately goes into action like a good army would to protect us. And so inflammation is the tool of the immune system, the first tool. And so, and then for some reason, and I believe our bodies are always trying to do the best by us. They're always trying to heal. But for some reason, that might lodge into somebody's thyroid and cause thyroiditis, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which is an autoimmune thyroid condition. Or it might be in the woman's reproductive system and cause endometriosis, technically, possibly yet to be confirmed as an autoimmune. I actually think the autoimmune description is moot anyway, because, all this over-labeling that we're doing, it's not very helpful. Ultimately, you've got to go back to the basics of well-being, which is, number one would be diet and nourishing yourselves, and that comes from gut health. So, there is science around that certain things open up the spaces between the cells in the gut. So you can get more technical, but if we're staying 101, it's basically around this digestive process. And I think we forget, and this is where the GAPS diet really heightened this awareness for me, was that it has primarily to do with the microbiome. And that has to do with the modern diet. So we've sanitized the modern diet. Most people don't eat very many fermented foods. They've avoided fats. They have too much fiber. And we have this gut environment that's conducive to parasites and the overgrowth of pathogenic, not just bacteria, but funguses and viruses as well, and whatever else there is that exists. And so these things are allowed to thrive. They adapt the environment to suit their own survival, which all species do. And then you put something into that environment, and there's an inflammation process, or there's toxic gases coming out of some of these microbes that are that enter into the bloodstream and cause issues around the body. So, if you follow the GAPS knowledge and all the research and the hypotheses and the confirmations that are coming out of that, then autoimmune is a gut disorder. Anything on the spectrum, autism is a gut disorder. Behavioral issues are gut disorders. And it's not hard to work out how that happens if you understand the absolute imperative nature of a healthy microbiome and how rare that is these days, given our lifestyle and environment.
You mentioned GAPS, the gut and psychology syndrome, and this is the work of Natasha Campbell McBride. I wondered if you've mentioned it a couple of times, if one was approaching gut issues through the GAPS protocol, what are some of the steps? I mean, I know it's complicated and all of that, but what are the basic principles of the GAPS approach?
Well, number one is to get I call it a sort of signature microbiome. So microbiome is basically the fingerprint or the signature of all the bacteria and fungus and virus in the gut, that whole picture. And so if that's out of balance, then there'll be symptoms in the body. So the GAPS protocol is really designed to heal the gut and to encourage the right microbes so that digestion and absorption and elimination occurs properly. And so it's also one of the foundational principles of it is that the body is made up of, it's a rough percentage, but we're half fat and half protein. And most of the population eats too much carbohydrate and not enough protein and fat. And these things, these nutrients, these macronutrients are essential for cell reproduction, particularly for the gut. And so it's restoring the integrity of all of the cells down the gut, the whole digestive system, so that they can do their job properly. And that really includes pancreatic health, liver health, gallbladder health, and stomach, and all those elements as well. So,
apart from the focus of the gut, though, what distinguishes the GAPS approach from other nutritional approaches?
Which ones would you be thinking of comparing it with? Because lots of diets aren't therapeutic gut diets. Lots of diets are weight loss or performance or some other intention.
Well, I suppose that's probably the biggest key, isn't it? That the GAPS approach is a therapeutic approach about rebuilding gut health.
Yes.
What are some of the things that help people do that using the GAPS approach? You mentioned fermented food, I guess, is one, but you wouldn't start necessarily with that, or would you? I don't know.
It depends on the severity of the condition. And, for somebody who's fairly healthy, like everyday health, but maybe has some constipation or some skin issues or something like that, then just bringing in more fermented foods might be very helpful. I think it's protein foods as well. So I'm a big fan of stocks and broths, and the liquid form of protein in those foods really supports the nourishment of the body and the nourishment of the digestive system. And there is a difference between stock and broth.
Okay.
And it's really the lighter version, which is the stock, that is very good, provides those amino acids required by the cells of the digestive system to make them work properly. And broths are usually with more bones and boiled for a lot longer, and they are also very beneficial and very nourishing. But can be triggering for someone with very severe gut disorders. So if you're talking about somebody who's cataclysmic with with schizophrenia or autism, that's a very different treatment protocol to someone who's just got, a migraine. Mind you, migraines are very debilitating. So, it's a whole range of things. And I suppose one of the beautiful things about working with somebody is that you really need to match the protocol to where the person's at. When I first learned GAPS, I was applying the GAPS diet to some of my clients, and it was just way too much for them, too restrictive, and they didn't have the motivation to go into that to that depth, but probably didn't need to either.
Mm-hmm.
A few gentle modifications, and that would have made all the difference for their sugar cravings and for their flatulence or whatever it might have been.
I think that's so interesting to hear you draw that distinction between stocks and broths, and I'm guessing the more severe the condition is that you're being presented with, the softer your approach to that would be. So a stock, a lighter version would be a gentler way of going, whereas the person who is just looking to tighten things up a bit and, literally and metaphorically, a broth would be okay, but it may be too much for those that are too sensitive. You mentioned it also involves eliminating certain foods. What are some of the foods that, that GAPS kind of is big on eliminating to get started with these more severe cases?
Well, interestingly, fibre. Food, really high fibre foods can be very irritating. And, effectively it's about starving the bad bacteria and feeding the good.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean bacteria loosely. It could be a fungus, could be a virus.
Mm-hmm.
And those bugs don't like dying. They do not like dying. And they excrete or shoot out all kinds of, as they die, toxins and mostly gases. If you think about beer bubbling away, producing gas, that's what bugs do, right? Or bread and yeast creating gas. That's what they do. So it's not just the wind that we get, but that some of those gases go through the digestive wall and into the bloodstream, and they can cause headaches and all kinds of horrible symptoms, like a healing crisis, I suppose you'd call it. And so the going slow and the going gentle is really about not, so the person doesn't end up in hospital or in bed or, vomiting in the toilet or whatever. So it is appropriate to go to match the protocol to where the person's at, so that you don't put them off for life, basically. But the foods to avoid, most of us know that, processed foods of modern commerce. I would say the top two is, and this won't be new to you and your listeners perhaps, but the top two would be processed sugar and processed fats. The industrialized seed oils are horrendous for the body and quite, I think, quite destructive.
And just to remind our listeners that those seed oils they may be more familiar to them as canola, sunflower, safflower, the ones that used to have the Heart Foundation tick on them, ironically. But anyway, they are the seed oils, which are great for longevity on the supermarket shelf. Not so good for our health. So the seed oils and the processed sugars. What about gluten and dairy? Do they present or are they tolerated? Where do gluten and dairy fit into that elimination process?
Yeah, well, grains are taken out fairly early on in the protocol and until the gut's healed, because they are difficult for the body to deal with. And you would know from the Western Price that in many, many cultures, they fermented their grains before they ate them. And in our food manufacturing process has upset a little bit of that, because things are raised very quickly. The raising agents all done very quickly. So your yogurt might not be fermented. I don't know. I know that one of the brands says that it's fermented for 6 hours, and I think that's probably great. But I make my yogurt and I'll let it ferment for 24 hours because the bugs will consume most of the lactose, which can be, an issue for some people. And then I think, dairy can be tolerated. I think dairy is a great food. Fermented dairy is a great food. I personally love it. I've got a Dutch history, and we love our dairy. And it's more the milk kefir and the yogurt and the cultured butter and the ghee, and these are the very nourishing fats that dairy can provide. And if somebody's leaning towards vegetarian and really won't eat meat or chicken or fish, they still need a lot of protein and a lot of animal-based fats. And so one of those options for them, because they're not getting the chicken fat, they're not getting the beautiful fats from the duck fat and that kind of thing, then the dairy is an option for them. And if you can't tolerate dairy, that tells us that your gut's not right for a start, not to avoid it necessarily, but that the gut needs healing, because a healthy gut can tolerate dairy. I'm generalizing a little bit. There are cases where the gut just won't tolerate it anymore. But if you have a little bit of dairy and then you get all mucousy, that really tells you that your gut isn't happy, and that it kind of needs those fats, but the environment isn't really conducive to that at the moment. And so that's just another message the body's telling you, my gut's not happy, my digestive system's not working properly.
It's so interesting, isn't it? We talk about the importance of feeding our microbiome internally, but here we are using a microbe to help us digest it even before we've taken it into our mouths. That's what the fermenting process is all about. And, you talk about industrial production of, say, breads. I think bread, if you're buying the commercial bread, it's proved within 2 hours and it's out the door, whereas sourdough, which ferments for a dough that ferments for 24 hours, a lot of the work is done even before we take it into our mouths, making it more accessible. Aren't microbes just fantastic?
Look, they're our best friends.
They're our best friends.
And I don't know where your stand is on this, Ron, about some people think that the digestive juices, the hydrochloric acid, kills off all those bacteria. I don't agree with that. I know from my GAPS training that bacteria, or fungus particularly, can survive in the gut because they have this capacity to create a biofilm around them and create these little microenvironments in the digestive system that keeps them alive. They're very, very, very clever. But I just think that the regular consumption of a variety of fermented foods, fermented beverages, kombucha, and maybe beer, that's a fermented beverage, but
you'd be hearing cheers go up there from some people.
I know, right? But that comes with the sugar as well, so you just got to be careful with that. That that is, instead of a probiotic, that is really giving us a really broad spectrum of new bugs in the gut that then have great benefits. Along with, of course, what you're talking about is that they partially digest things that are hard to eat, hard for us to digest, and they also release the nutrients out of. So a cabbage is 20% more nutritious if it's fermented than if it's just raw. And then a lot of people can't tolerate raw foods. Their digestive system really is not healthy enough for that. And so, or that, they say, I get wind if I eat cabbage, or, maybe a little bit of wind is okay. But, when you've got a really robust digestive system and you chew things properly and your stomach acid's working and your pancreatic and your liver is all working together, then eating those things shouldn't be an issue. And fruit's another thing that's very controversial. I don't agree with avoiding fruit, because you're on a ketogenic diet and you can't have any fruit. I think fruit is one of the joys of life. Watermelon in summer and a mango. Every year we want to have a mango. But in the GAPS protocol, and even with the Wise Traditions diet, they typically encourage you to cook fruits. It's cooked apples and cooked pears and that kind of thing. That tends to be a lot easier on the digestive system. So you can see there's this real theme of orienting your life and including your diet to maximize digestive function, optimize digestive function.
What do you think? I mean, a very popular movement now is the vegan movement, and I think, well-meaning people are making choices about the ethics of what they are eating. But it does pose a couple of issues, doesn't it? And you mentioned protein and fat as being really important. And as far as I know, evolutionarily speaking, I don't think there has been a culture that has gone generation after generation and thrived and survived on a vegan diet. But putting that aside, the vegan diet presents us with some challenges, doesn't it? If we're advising people, how do you deal with that when you talk to somebody who is a vegan?
Well, it's a very controversial topic because it's hooked in with morality.
Yes.
And things like, animal protection and emotional topics that people are very passionate about.
Yes.
So I'm conscious that it's well-meaning that you're talking about.
Yep.
My own view is that the marketing machine has jumped on the bandwagon of vegan and somewhat vegetarian diets. There is a massive emerging industry around fake foods, around plant-based foods. Yep. And my observation, having been a nutritionist for 30 years, is that there's now a message, a narrative in our culture that vegan is healthy, vegetarian is healthier than meat. And that's a relatively new narrative. 100 years ago or 200 years ago, that wasn't the case. Our grandparents grew up with catching the duck in autumn to put on a little bit of fat for us for the winter. That's going back a few generations now. We associate vegetarianism with yoga and with the Indian and Sri Lankan and those cultures, but they brought in vegetarian and vegetarianism, not veganism, but vegetarianism for spiritual reasons, for cleansing, for reducing libido, for if you track back vegetarianism in those cultures, it came in at a certain point. Prior to that, it was really sort of peasants and what peasant people had access to. And so I think a little bit of education around this is very important. I think it's very important to listen to your body. If you are vegan and you have 3 autoimmune diseases, then something's not working that you really need to be honest with yourself about. And there is a greater tendency, I believe, in vegans and vegetarians to have autoimmune diseases. So we're really not having that conversation at the moment. So I work the best I can with vegans, but it is difficult. And really, I just do what I can and let them go and discover for themselves. And then they tend to come back a year later and say, I'm not doing that anymore. It's my health doesn't allow it. My genetics, my grandparents and my parents weren't vegans. I don't think that this is the diet for me. And great, then we just work with that. Personally, I think that vegan diet is a fast and not a lifestyle. And that it's a great, if you go a weekend away for a detox retreat, or you go to India for a month and you live in an ashram, or you go on the Camino and do, you go to Mecca for, this is a beautiful time to fast and to have minimal, just have seeds and fruits and vegetables and so on. But I personally don't believe, with my in-depth now understanding of the requirements, the nutritional requirements of the body, that veganism is a nutritionally sufficient diet. I know that some people won't agree with that, but it may be not, as you talk about, Ron, it may be not in your lifetime that you get to see these outcomes. It may be if you are vegan and have been vegan all your life, and then you have children and they have children, that the challenges start to arise. And it's hard for us to see that in the long term. And I understand that I'm making an opinion based on that. I'm giving a professional opinion based on that. But I have researched it, and I believe that to be the case, that we will see over time the outcomes. But I do think that we all owe it to ourselves to be skeptical of marketing messages that are nutritionally based. I think that it's very hard to find wise, effective, science-based or added in science, science acknowledged or science confirmed information on diet, and it's not in the mainstream. No. So you've got to actually seek that out if you want to be an informed vegetarian.
This is why when we started the conversation on Western Aid Price, why I think you and I have both been attracted to it, because there are many lessons from the past that we have to learn. And as far as the ethics go, I have absolutely no argument with that. I'm a champion of regenerative agriculture, and rather than animals being the problem, they're part of the solution if properly managed and cared for. So what's good for the animal is good for the planet, is good for our health. It's good. It's a win-win-win. But one thing now, we're going to talk about menopause, because I know that's a big topic for a big focus for you, and it isn't a pathology. It is just a fact of life. But tell us about, and this is for our male listeners as well, but tell us about menopause, how it affects women.
Well, menopause is a stage of life. You're right. It's not a disease. And similarly to puberty. So some will say that it's puberty in reverse. Some will say, in fact, in Chinese culture, they call it the second spring. So you've got to understand that our Western culture has quite a negative narrative around menopause and postmenopausal aging women. We tend to be very judgmental about wrinkles and grey hair and anything really associated with, scary older women. There is this, from the witch hunt days, there's still this, older women are a bit too mysterious, a bit too strange, a bit too powerful, perhaps, with their black cats and their cauldrons. We don't really want to go there. So, there's just so many fairy tales and all kinds of things around women at this age. And
kind of reinforcing the patriarchy.
100%.
Absolutely.
100%.
Yep.
And it's another one of those things that, that's been normalized, sort of hot flushes and all the stuff that women typically experience has been normalized and pathologized. So there isn't any education around, or enough education around, what is normal. It is normal to feel anxious because you're going through a transition, a hormonal transition. Your brain's being rewired, your body's being rewired to be finishing up with reproduction and into the next stage, which is really about wisdom and wildness. The postmenopausal years, there's a lot of wildness. If you could sum up the nature of it, it's wise and wild, basically. There is a greater sensitivity to the injustices in the world that occurs, and that can bring up anger and frustration. So there's a lot of emotional shifts and changes that occur with the transitioning of the hormones. And there, of course, is a lot of physical adjustments as well. But you've got to also remember that most women, by the time they're 50, aren't particularly healthy. Your average person isn't particularly healthy. Are they exercising? Are they managing their stress? Are they eating a nourishing diet? I don't know what the statistics are, Ron. Maybe you know, but Not the majority of people at that age are not healthy.
No.
And so you have the protective role of estrogen withdrawing, and everything comes to light. All those things that those late nights and those not slowing down to relax, and those few too many alcoholic beverages, or a few too many sweet things, they become more apparent. It's not really menopause's fault. It's just that they come to light at that time. Thyroid issues come to light, and autoimmune conditions come to light, because we just can't keep doing to ourselves what we've been doing. Sensitivity is part of that wild and wise nature. A woman wants to be more sensitive. She's more intuitive. She's more connected to the earth. She's more connected to the grandchildren. And her role as protector of the community, or leader of the community, starts to. I'm getting into kind of.
No, I love it. I think it's great. I mean, this is all part of the reality of what it is.
Yeah. And, I know my own experience. I was healthy because I'd been a naturopath for a long time, and I thought, I'll just skip menopause, because menopause is just hot flushes and a few other things, isn't it? And I thought, oh, well, I won't get that because I'm looking after myself. But I didn't realize that it's a psychological journey. It's a rite of passage, and a rite of passage is going from one status through this washing machine turmoil into another status. If you think about what a child goes to become an adult, those teen years change everything. All those hormonal changes, not just our bodies, but who we're attracted to, who we want to be with, reproduction and libido, and all these things occur at this time. And the same thing is happening, but different, at that 45 to 55 roughly age range as well. And so I think we need to know what's normal first to be able to identify what's abnormal. Because the odd hot flush and feeling warmer and all those kinds of things, it's normal. And it's not really until it becomes quality of life threatening that often women seek help. And by that time, the only option is chemical. And a lot of us don't want to go down that path. And yet, how do you know that there's other options? Women will go sometimes to the health food store and buy a herbal formula that's for hot flushes. But what if the hot flushes are coming from gut inflammation? What if the hot flushes are coming from dehydration? What if the hot flushes are coming from anger? They can. What if the hot flushes are some other kind of stress? Then that hormonal package, that bottle of hormonal herbs may not be the right thing for that woman.
And I imagine you mentioned the psychological, the way we approach this and talk about a narrative. I mean, if this is a natural and normal and a second spring, I love that. The menopause as a second spring and a wise and wild time in a woman's life. What a way of thinking about that, rather than looking at what society pumps out at us. Oh my God, you're aging, you've got to do something about that. And you go and see a doctor, and perhaps even menopause becomes pathologized. It does. I mean, how does the medical profession typically deal with this issue?
They are spending, at least the pharmaceutical industry is spending gazillions of dollars on making chemical alternatives really the primary choice. And of course, if you go to see a doctor, that would be the case. But I don't think you can medicate a life transition, a stage. We try. There's antidepressants, very common. And there is some research to suggest that antidepressants can even help with hot flushes. So sometimes you can go in for hot flushes and come out with an antidepressant, even though you're not depressed. There's obviously chemical hormones, which are unfortunately very effective. Maybe people think fortunately, but I think unfortunately, because I think they're not the first response, in my opinion. Let's try a few things first. let's look at the lifestyle. Let's look at gut health. Let's look at some of those health markers like the stool, bowel habits, and the hormone and that kind of thing, and see what we can do and take responsibility for first.
Is that HRT? That's HRT, hormone replacement therapy, about delaying the onset or managing it? What's the rationale behind the use of it? Is it to delay the onset of menopause, and what's going on? I wonder.
I think well, it overrides the pill, and HRT overrides our own reproductive system. And one of my mentors says that a pill bleed is not a real bleed. So it literally mimics the cycle, but it's not the cycle. So you're missing out on some of those natural endorphins that occur with being connected to your own cycle. And to some degree, you delay the end of menstruation by being on HRT because you can keep menstruating, but I'm not sure that you entirely skip menopause, because menopause is more than just the hormones. Menopause is a growing up. It's a time of looking back on your life, and often a time of spiritual awakening, because it's said that in the Native American culture, a woman isn't grown up until she's 52. And so the hormonal profile of a postmenopausal woman, I don't know, I think it encourages you to take responsibility for your life. It encourages you to be a leader even. And in the research around the grandmother theory, which is basically around whales, which is the only other species that menstruates that we know of and has a menopause, they found that the role of the postmenopausal whale is community leadership. So this is the grandmother theory that's been hypothesized, that grandmothers need to support mothers in the raising of healthy children. And I think there's lots of that could apply to our Western culture that's very devoid of, like, so lonely, so alienated, so isolated, so disconnected. I think there's great value in bringing this grandmother theory to our culture.
I'd agree with that, and that's just from my limited experience of watching my own wife be a wonderful grandmother. But I totally agree with that. You mentioned that the problem, of course, is that, and I think the statistic is about people's health coming into any stage in life, but menopause. And I think the statistics are that at least half the population have at least one comorbidity, and I think 20 or 30% have several comorbidities. And by comorbidities, we mean diagnosable disease like autoimmune conditions, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and I'd include mental health in that as well. What can people do? What can women do to prepare for a smoother experience if they are facing menopause, apart from enthusiastically embracing it, as an honor, and it is an honor to have got to that point in life, because I think we all know people who would have been very happy to have got to menopause and just didn't quite make it.
Yeah, well, what I experience with most women sort of under 45 is denial.
Yep.
So, and I was guilty of that. It's like, no, it's not going to happen to me. And I didn't want to know about my symptoms being menopausal till the absolute last minute. I was frightened of it in a way. And there was so much going on in my life at the time, because one of the things that you have in that later stage in life is you've had enough years on the planet to have retrospective, that you have a retrospective view on your life. And so there's a lot of intra reflection that goes on. So I'm being on the other side of it. I wouldn't skip it for anything in the world. But I hear the essence of your question. I think that the most common advice that I give for women, say 40, 38, 42, whatever, is to nourish your adrenals, to make sure that you're not burnt out by the time you get to 45. Because the adrenals are adrenals are part of the endocrine system, just as the reproductive hormones are. And some of the production of estrogen is taken over by the adrenal glands, because that's basically where it all comes from in the first place, from testosterone. We make estrogen out of testosterone. And our Western culture and the busyness of the sandwich generation, which is that generation where they've got teens and young adults and kids, but they've also often got aging dependent parents as well, is they tend to be burnt out. And burning out, which is high cortisol, means you don't sleep properly, and then you're more burnt out and more exhausted. And by the time you get to the hormonal, can I use this word, screw up?
Sure.
The endocrine screw up that menopause kind of is, the washing machine ride that you're on for a while, 5 years sometimes, 10, that your resources are depleted. And so then your mental health gets affected. Then your ability to look after yourself is compromised, and you really need to eat well, and you really need to exercise to have resources and reserves to draw from. So, I mean, that's a message for any woman at any stage of her life, really. But
and man.
And men. 100%. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
I mean, adapting to aging is a little bit easier for men because, they're still fertile. The culture doesn't idolize 25-year-old men as much as they idolize 25-year-old women. And older men are still a little bit sexy, whereas older women are typically not. So, but there's you can see parallels between women's health and men's health here as well. And after all, we do kind of work together. So it's important for all of us to be doing the right things as far as our health goes.
Listen, we've covered so much territory here today, and I want to thank you for doing that with me. And we will, of course, have links to your website so people can find out more about the gaps and find more about women's health and that whole journey, because there was so much here that I loved today. So thank you so much for joining us and sharing your knowledge and wisdom with us.
Thank you so much. And I would say, Ron, that everything that's in my head, if it was on a website, it would be like a library, and so if people want to reach out and have a half an hour session with me free of charge, that's probably an even better way of connecting. And I'm most happy to provide that to your audience. So, but I will put my details. I'll give you my details. So, and thank you very much for the opportunity to share my message. I'm very grateful.
A pleasure. So there it is. There was so much in that episode. The GAPS protocol, which we referred to, is something that I will definitely explore in a future podcast, but it is from the work of a neurologist, actually. I think she's a medical practitioner and neurologist, Natasha Campbell McBride, who's written a book that's now probably over 20 years old called GAPS, Gut and Psychological Syndrome. The GAPS approach, it's quite a bout focused on rebuilding gut health. And I think Brenda made that point very well. And I love the fact that menopause is really the second spring and a time for women to be wise and wild. And I think it's something to be celebrated. And celebrating it in good health by laying down foundations early in a woman's life is obviously critical. There too. Look, we'll have links to Brenda's website. Brenda is part of our advisory expert panel on the Unstress Health platform. So there's lots of resources on her website and, of course, on ours. I hope this finds you well. Until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well. This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions, experiences, and conclusions.